Here we are, CKLN listeners, on October 2nd, 2007. I have the absolute privilege of speaking with Mr. Alan Watt, a Canadian national treasure and gift to the world at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Mr. Watt, I hope you're not bothered by flattery. I really do love your work, and your thoughts on sort of where we are today and how we got here.
Well, how we got here is the most incredible journey, because we got here through about 100 years of planning by big foundations in conjunction with big business, which really were one and the same thing. The foundations were in bed from the beginning with international corporatism, and they planned, and wrote about it too, they planned about a tripartite world 100-odd years ago, and how they would get there through creating big institutions and foundations, which, remember, they outlive any one generation, and they have a mandate. Therefore, they can go on for many generations with the same mandate and bring it all to pass. And then you go into the 1800s, where Britain looked towards this up-and-coming thing called democracy, which they thought was going to be a nuisance, because with all the arguing and infighting, they'd never get their big plans made. Therefore, they had a parallel government set up, chartered by the British Crown. One of the groups was the Cecil Rhodes Foundation, which took over the mineral and the diamond rights and gold rights of Africa. But they also had ones for India and other parts of the world, and for Americas too. And then at the beginning of the First World War, they had the League of Nations. Now that was pushed by all the members of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the big British Crown organization, with its American counterpart, the Council for Foreign Relations. And they wanted a global government set up with three trading blocks: a united Europe to be first, followed by a united Americas, and then a united Far Pacific Rim region. And they set up organizations to bring all that about. Now, I don't know if you saw the CBC News in 2000, in fact this year, since 2005, 6 and 7, they found that the presidents and prime ministers of the Americas have got together to further integrate the NAFTA amalgamation. And for the first time this year, the Council on Foreign Relations came out as a non-governmental body, admitting that they drafted up the legislation for the integration for the Americas and gave it to the governments to sign. Now, where's the democracy here?
Absolutely, and with respect to that, it seems to me like the shadow government is the key to this. People need to understand that. Can you explain to people who don't believe that there is a secret bureaucracy that truly controls the levers of power, who they are and how they operate?
Well, what they did, and Margaret Thatcher explained this in Massey Hall in Ontario about 1991 or 92. She gave a lecture entitled The New World Order, and it was published on a Sunday in the Toronto Sun, and I was amazed that it even got into print. I think the editor must have been off that day, but it was a closed forum basically for round table members. That's part of the Council on Foreign Relations, as they call them, the Round Table Society. They do the debating and find out ways to actually put all this stuff into plans and make it work. And Margaret Thatcher said, we, the retired politicians, never leave government. She says, we are the parallel government. She says, with all our years of experience, we know all the other prime ministers and premiers of all countries, and we therefore form another government, a parallel government that's not responsible to the people, and therefore, because they're outside of party politics, she says, we can plan things and make them happen and pull them off quickly. It's more efficient, and that's exactly what the Royal Institute for International Affairs was set up to do 100-odd years ago.
Right, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs essentially runs the world through their satellite arms like the Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations. So basically, Mr. Watt, even though most activists out there and others, I guess most of the people in the world think America runs everything, in fact, it's England. It's
England. If you've noticed, over the last 15 years or so, every major figure and prime minister or president of the U.S., or even guys like Kissinger, vice presidents, go over to Britain to be knighted once their term in office is over. Now, why is it so? Apart from that, it's unconstitutional, according to the American Constitution, for any of them to be involved as advisors or politicians and take foreign titles, yet they've been doing this for years, but it's very important for them to go and do so. And we also find that even the ex-premier of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, went over and got knighted as well. So that's the central hub of all of this. And then you go back into the free trade agreements, who came up with it, but John Dee presented it to Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century. He gave us the term, the British Empire, and he said it was based on free trade, where countries who would come in would have to eventually adopt the same monarchical type system, the feudal type system, but they'll be given special privileges on duty imports, etc., if they joined. And he also said that ones that came in from the Far East would be given most favored nation status. That was printed in the 16th century. And here we have China today being granted most favored nation status. They haven't changed a bit of this whole plan.
Unbelievable. So, it's funny, we're speaking with Alan Watt from cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Strongly recommend going there and downloading all of his work as much as he lets you, and of course supporting him by purchasing whatever you can, because regardless of whether or not you look at it now, it may come in handy if the economy collapses and the internet goes down. So to all the listeners out there, please do that. Mr. Watt's worked very hard to get this information out there. It seems, Mr. Watt, that there was an old saying in the British Empire that where they talked about how America, they said they have all the bombs, but we have all the brains. And would you say that our socialization, even here, even though it seems to be coming out of Hollywood and MTV, is in fact designed in England? It's designed in England because back in the late 60s, they had one meeting, a global meeting for all the Council on Foreign Relations, Royal Institute for International Affairs. And remember, all Commonwealth countries has its own Institute for International Affairs. We have the Canadian Institute for International Affairs. It's all the same organization. We have them in India, we have them in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And they had a global meeting held in London, printed in the newspapers at the time, to decide which country, the United States or England, would promote the new culture for the global society through movies, big magazines, and music, and the arts, and so on. And I think they held it for 2 to 3 weeks, and then they published their findings and said that they decided that Hollywood and the music industry based in Los Angeles and in New York would be given the right to give the global culture, create the global culture through arts and entertainment to the whole world. Well, let's talk about that for a second, Mr. Watt, because as you obviously know, Hollywood and America is exporting their culture at an exponential rate. It's dominating. I mean, they have things like the McDonald's theory of diplomacy, where two countries with a McDonald's won't go to war, and that's supposed to be the reason for every country to have a McDonald's. So on an academic level and on a sort of plebeian level, it's being sold as the thing to do for world peace, and yet it never seems to result in that. How controlled is it in Hollywood? I mean, are all the actors we see on TV, all the models being promoted in our newspapers, are they in some way affiliated with these groups that are planning our socialization? Some of them understand it. Susan Sarandon, for instance, she came out at the same time, the same awards ceremony, that others came out and spoke out against the war with Iraq. And she did use the proper term, that I haven't heard outside the old Soviet Union. She said, we being part of the culture creation industry, because we are the culture creators, she said. That's how she started her little talk off. So some of them understand what their purpose is. It's not to entertain us, it's to do predictive programming. Now, the producers and the writers certainly do know what they're there for. There's no problem there. They understand perfectly their role is to create a culture by familiarizing us along fictitious lines with ideas which are yet to come, and that's called predictive programming. It was started off in Tavistock Institute in London, England, and they found that they could actually put ideas in plays and in movies on science fiction ideas, and when the real thing came along in your life, because you were vaguely familiar with the idea, you accepted it much more easily. You didn't question it. And so that's called predictive programming. And you'll find almost every movie that you watch, it'll catch you up with the usual hero and the heroine thing, the bad guys, the good guys, but there's always a twist in there to do with science or a new type of technology which we must all comply with,
or a future society with totalitarian ID cards everywhere, or even implanted chips. This is called predictive programming. So the public eventually go along with this step by step and think it's inevitable, that it's somehow normal.
Yeah, I suppose we remember certain things that we saw in the movies. I recently saw Resident Evil Extinction, where the British, German, and American elite were hiding in underground bunkers miles under the surface of the Earth after having killed most of the population, turned a bunch of the rest into zombies, and leaving a few stragglers to hunt for supplies up there. And they were just trying to figure out how to get back up. I mean, do you see this as a possible future with the sort of advances in bioweapons and nuclear technology?
The scary thing is, the more you dig in to the big published authors, the people who spoke on behalf of the old global aristocracy, especially the European aristocracy, people like Charles Galton Darwin, in his book, The Next Million Years, he goes through this scenario, very Malthusian in content, and he goes along with the idea of the necessity of culling off the useless eaters, as he termed them. He and Bertrand Russell both belonged to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and they both called them the useless eaters. Those who didn't produce and consume in the society would have no place in the society. And we find Charles Galton Darwin in The Next Million Years plans out at least the next 1,000 years and how they're going to bring the populations down by using inoculations, which would sterilize the male and the female. The introduction of new diseases through various means, and even upping, giving female hormones to males to make them less aggressive, therefore they wouldn't fight the changes that would come. And you find today that the xenoestrogen levels in males and females is skyrocketing, mainly because of the introduction of plastic bottles. They made it very trendy for you to drink water of plastic bottles, and they give off xenoestrogen. They knew this back in the 1950s, that this would happen.
Wow, I drink tons of water from a plastic bottle, and I have to admit, I'm pretty chilled out. So, but Mr. Watt, Alan Watt at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, I'd just like to ask you, for people out there who are listening to this interview, is there a way they can keep the culture they are familiar with, they've learned to love, and not be affected by it, its toxicity? Is there a way, perhaps if they listen to your podcast on the way to work and they kind of get the big picture, then maybe they can look at some of these things from a fresh eye and keep certain ideas and throw out the rest because they know they lead to global government and the enslavement of humanity. So I'd just like to ask if you can see sort of a middle ground where people can keep the culture they've learned to love.
I think they can keep, culture is given to us, that's the problem. In every age, we get a culture given or updated for the present time or for the industry or for whatever it happens to be. I've been involved in the music industry for years, and I know what's getting pushed and why they push it, because they tell you what they want, even gender-neutral songs. So believe you me, there's no such thing as even a free music industry. The writers know exactly what they're supposed to write about and not write about. So you got to really sort out what is real within your culture. And what I tell people is basically this is a war of really the mass man led by the global elite against the individual. If we can regain our individuality and accept the tolerance, you've got to be very tolerant to be an individual. People should be able to agree to disagree without any bad feelings. That's what being an individual really is. And the elite don't want individuality because you're unpredictable. And for a totalitarian, efficient system, everybody in it must be predictable. That's why the incredible surveillance we're having today and the data collection on every single person. They want to know all about each one of you and how predictable you must be. They do not like individuality at all. Groups they encourage, mass groups they definitely encourage, and they will lead and fund because it's easier to control large groups than a few scattered individuals. So individuality really is what we have to start promoting. Absolutely.
I was at an event, an anti-poverty rally here in Toronto on September 26th. 107 groups in Toronto got together through the event, exceptionally boring, almost nothing new there. Basically, quotes from the mainstream media about what they want, sort of fudging around budget cuts and whatnot, and those type of threats from the government. And 107 groups in Toronto could not possibly get that little done, in my opinion, unless it was on purpose. Can you speak to the sort of CI activism, as I like to call it, of groups that are set up, just so people out there aren't confused into taking their natural concerns about a dangerous world and directing them in the wrong fashion?
Well, we do know that as far back as the 1800s, Britain, that led the field in this whole respect, since they always planned ahead on a global scale, they knew when they introduced a new policy or something that would upset different people, that rather than have a grassroots organization actually come into being by itself, they would put out leaders and fund what appear to be grassroots organizations. And then most people would sit back and say, that's great, someone else is doing all the work for me. And you sit back, and then a few years later, you look into what they've been up to, and it's nothing like you imagined. They went off on a different tangent completely. Well, these are the red herrings that they give us. They're very good at it. But I do know, too, and I got this from a guy involved in this particular incident. He had complained loudly about the corruption in Ottawa and how the politicians all knew that the global agenda was going on. They all knew that we're being sold down the river through amalgamation, that healthcare was to go out the window and all the rest of it. And he spoke out on CBC about this and said something to the extent that we should all march on Ottawa and do some rather nasty things to the politicians, which is a no-no according to CSIS. And this fellow comes from Ontario. Well, CSIS followed them to work every day. He got used to meeting them. He took them coffee in the mornings and chatted to them, thinking he could perhaps wake them up too. And one morning, as this guy Brian was mentioning to them what was happening to Canada being sold down the river through the amalgamation, the CSIS agent said to him, he says, you don't understand, Brian, we want you to start a revolution. We want something to happen in Canada. And that's right, that's exactly what they do. So even the so-called patriot groups, the patriotic groups, are used. One day they will be used to start something so that the big boys can clamp down and tell the general public, look, there are crazy people living amongst you, and we've got to do something for your safety. This is what they want to do. And they have written about this, in fact, from the top. Yeah.
Is there a way, Mr. Alan Watt, from cuttingthroughthematrix.com for us to appeal to members of the secret government who don't want to see this through? The fascist boa constrictor will eventually trap all of us. We may be tracked and searched and drugged and chipped, and even the people on the inside to maintain control as they are increasingly asked to dehumanize the rest of us, and some resist. I mean, they'll be caught in this too, won't they? So is there? Yeah. Can you see a way to convince them not to go along with this?
Some of them on the lower fringes are beginning to see this already. They see that their own necessity of being with them will no longer be necessary in a few years, and they're beginning to panic about it. The ones who are higher up within the higher cabinets or ex-members of high cabinet positions, they're different. They believe they'll always go on to higher positions within the United Nations. And in fact, some of them already have. But the lower members are beginning to panic. There's even people in the media now starting to question their role. They know darn well they've been there to fool the public for years and give us trivia and nonsense. And some of them are getting in touch with me now, which is a good thing. It's a good sign.
Absolutely, and my friends and I went to a Toronto Masonic Research Group open house meeting at University of Toronto on September 22nd. It was around 8 p.m. at the George Ignatieff Theatre, and one of the guys went inside. The rest of us were outside with a copy of Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, and we were talking to, we were filming a little documentary outside and then talking to some of the Masons and visitors who came out to speak with us, and one of the guys was a National Post reporter who wrote an article that heavily referenced us being there. So that was a good sign. Mm-hmm. With respect to the media, can you speak to how they are controlled? I think people know the media lies, but don't know what the lies are, and so they get kind of confused and by sort of making up their own schizophrenic realities. And furthermore, when people hang out with nothing but liars, they get paranoid. So they say to me, "How do you know who tells the truth?" And I'm like, the same way I know my friends and family tell the truth. I hang out with them, I don't catch them in lies, and then I trust them. People like yourself, I've heard lots of times, and you just don't sound like you're lying. Whereas most people flip between different channels of liars and just assume you cannot find the truth and remain agnostic. So can you speak to the media control just so people get it clear once and for all?
Well, the media control, media means in the middle, remember, they're the middleman. And up till 50 years ago, and perhaps after 50 years, but definitely 50 years ago, people were always suspicious about newspapers and moguls, etc., because they knew their history. They knew that they'd always been used for propaganda purposes, for different factions. But today, people have forgotten that. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the vice president of the U.S. for some years ago, and who's still an advisor to the presidents, Zbigniew Brzezinski said in his book, Between Two Ages, he says, the time will come, he says, through careful indoctrination, that the general public will come to rely on the media to do their reasoning for them. They will give up their ability to reason for themselves and expect the media to do it for them. And unfortunately, through careful and incessant and long-term propaganda, they've been very successful in that way. That's why they keep major news anchormen there for 30 years, 40 years sometimes. You grow up with them, they're your father figure. They look right in your eye like Mr. Mansbridge does. And would he lie to you? Is in your home every night at dinner time, and you're taught to see him as a father figure, an authoritative figure that's impeccably truthful. And it never occurs to people that you're getting nothing but propaganda, and you're being misled from the real truth, what's really happening in the world. And that's his job, and all the other ones. We saw the same in the U.S. with Dan Rather. They kept him forever, and all the other big players. And Britain is no different. That's why they're paid such big salaries. And people forget, these guys are not telling you what they think about anything. They're reading a dummy board that someone else wrote for them. And they're staring at a camera at the same time.
Absolutely. And with respect to the media, I guess it's hard to believe that they can keep their jobs if they are screwing up by lying every day. I don't think you keep your job at McDonald's by screwing up the Big Mac every day.
Yeah.
So how does that work in terms of their control by intelligence agencies? Do you see a separation?
No. Oh, no. The U.S. was more forthcoming about having agents within all major media outlets, including the telephone companies. Britain also came out years ago with the same statements. In fact, the BBC, remember, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the grandparent of the CBC, and even the China broadcasting stations now, because they run them as well. But the BBC, for most of its time, never hired anyone, any employee, in any level that did not come from Eton. They wanted to keep it within a certain class control, where they believe they'd all go along with the same agenda, and I think that still stands today. They're all from Eton to make sure they keep a centralized control of all news to the British people.
And in Canada, do you have any specifics for our listeners that would reflect? I mean, some of the people that they see, some of the news networks that they see, are there better, worse ones? Are there more controlled ones, or are they all sort of aware of the same game they're playing and how they define the two sides of an argument that are missing key facts?
Well, you've got it right on there. They always give you the two sides. They give you the two sides of every argument that you're supposed to see, so that you don't see the third side, the fourth side, the fifth side, and the sixth side. They always give you one or the other, the left and the right, or whatever it happens to be. And they give you your opinions. The general public will always pick between one or the other, a choice of two. But at CBC here, now I had someone from the CBC who was going to do something for me, some artwork. And he was up there in a big department within the CBC. He did a couple of things for me, very small things, and he was going to do a lot more. And he also had a job at night for himself. He did the same kind of stuff with a whole bank of computers. His computers all went down. His boss called him into the office the next day and told him that if he had anything more to do with me, he would be out of a job and his family would be homeless, basically. So believe you me, the CBC is totally controlled, and it's got lots of agents within it.
Right. It seems like they make some nods towards credibility by giving us one bit of truth, but propaganda, as I see it, Mr. Alan Watt from cuttingthroughthematrix.com, is what they all decide to push at once. I remember just a few months ago, the global warming hype was all pushed at once, and even people who weren't watching the news were freaking out on me about it, calling me a Bush supporter for sort of questioning it. And then as soon as Bush sort of caved a bit, they went, see, even Bush knows global warming is real. So they just literally repeated the nonsense in the media. Can you speak to what is the difference between propaganda and what is more likely truth in terms of the isolated stories that might contradict the big waves that are pushed everywhere, so that people who are completely unrelated are all repeating the same thing?
Well, once again, what you've noticed is even here in Canada, and I was in Chapters bookstores today, and I just glanced at the green section, and there's our David Suzuki, a geneticist, of course, who is also a true believer in eugenics, who loves furry animals, but is not too keen on too many people. Pushing the greening phase, and he's next door to Al Gore's book. Al Gore, that was just a front man for this agenda, and ghostwriters wrote the book. And then you go back to the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome, as one of the premier think tanks for the future, they come up with policies to direct society, and they work out ways to market the ideas into the public's heads, basically. And in their own book, The Club of Rome, the founders of the Club of Rome admit, and this book is called The First Global Revolution by the Club of Rome. You'll find in there, and I've got references on my website to it, I read it out on the air before, they said, we try to find ways to frighten the people into coming together globally and giving up their rights, basically, under a new world system. And so they thought about all the things that could terrify the public, because they'd always used wars before for this very purpose. And going global means you have to find a new enemy. And eventually they said, we settled on a threat of global warming, which we will claim is caused by the public. That was written in the 1970s.
Wow, okay, so this was planned since the 70s. This is nothing new, and it's funny, Mr. Watt, the fact that they started with global warming because it's scarier. I mean, if they'd started with climate change, I know here in Toronto, I think most of us would have laughed our butts off by going, we have 4 seasons, you moron, and the climate changes every day in Toronto, so better pack a sweater. But now they've switched from global warming to climate change. Do you see any cracks in their approach that we can I guess, exploit?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's got me really amazed is how, like George Orwell said, they take history and put it down the memory hole. With every republication, you find that history goes missing in big chunks. And I can remember going to school, and when I was about 7 years of age, we got to geography, and they were telling us about all the different mini ice ages that we go through and how they built homes in the 12th century without chimneys in Britain because they didn't need fires. It was so warm. And they went back into a cooling phase. We were taught this was all quite normal, going up and down like a yo-yo down through the centuries. But today, of course, they've removed all that from the books. They've got a generation who've grown up with massive propaganda and without the history of geography given to them. So therefore they think somehow have always been the same up until now, and it's suddenly changing. That isn't true at all. We go through these mini warming phases and freezing phases. And I say, what do you think is between ice ages? Well, you have a warming period between ice ages. Otherwise, you'd have a constant ice age, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. It's ridiculous. And we didn't cause the ice age either. That big climate change wasn't caused by SUVs or our individual carbon footprint. And frankly, Mr. Watt, I mean, outside of the fraud itself, even in the mainstream, I questioned Green Party provincial leader Frank de Jong on what the heck are they going to do with the money. I haven't seen plans for an $800 billion giant dustbuster to dust bust the earth. It seems like they're just using our money to make money.
Well, they are. There's no doubt about it. These are incredible boom times for these guys. They just pocket money left, right, and center under a whole bunch of organizations that they just happen to have a hand in themselves personally. No, this whole thing is about control. They've talked about, and now the UN has sent me the books on this stuff just to get my opinion of them, of these books, on the new domed cities they want to bring in, very small domed cities, habitat areas where the public will live. However, they want to separate the age groups within these domes. And so you'll have one for the nursery, just like the science fiction writers were writing about in the 1950s. You have one for the working types and one for the elderly, where that's the exit type homes. And I talked to a top architect back in the 70s in Toronto. Prince Charles is on this guy's polo team, so this guy's pretty wealthy. And he showed me a dome city, a drawing that he'd done for it. And I said, that's Toronto in there, isn't it? He says, yeah. I says, well, I see the CN Tower and some of the streets, but where's the rest of Toronto? He says, oh, it's going to be a much smaller city by then. And so what he meant was that the population was to be reduced. So I've already been sent some of these books on the dome cities from the UN associations to get my opinion on them. And I haven't got back to them on it, but I think they get the gist of where I'm going anyway. It's not for me type of thing. But they want everyone to be removed from the rural areas, forced in to these cities, the overcrowded cities initially. Then you'll have a sort of Soylent Green type scenario where we're all crammed together in a big bunch of pollution. And then the elite themselves will live like the Soviet bureaucracy did, with their dash hours off in the country and their butlers and servants. That's to be the new type of system. So those who work for the system itself in the bureaucratic field or the educational field or the policing field will have their own special habitat areas, high tech, and outside of the major cities. That is the future they have planned.
Unbelievable. Most of these people are fairly isolated anyway right now. I don't think they have real friends, just competitors at that level and competitors to move up in this global scheme. So they don't really care about people as is. So this doesn't seem like much for a lot of the super rich. But back to the environment and the environmentalists, I'm afraid that I've got a few friends, especially here in Toronto, that want to do their part, and they want to, take a bag to work that's not use plastic bags and grow more efficient this and buy more efficient that and pay $8 for a light bulb and all this nonsense.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the sort of history of the environmental movement? Because I have to remind people that when I give them a sentence that sort of shatters that worldview, it may not be enough to be 25 years of propaganda, but hopefully it opens up their minds to sort of asking more questions on their own every time they're sold something new.
Well, the main environmental groups were set up prior to World War II. That was the main tenet, remember, of Adolf Hitler, by the way. And before him, in the 1800s, Blavatsky in London, who started the first sort of female lodge at the time that became mixed, that was Theosophy. They also pushed this Lebensraum type idea, the living space, but for the right people. And Nature Conservancy came into it big time. In America and Canada, the field was funded from the beginning by the Rockefeller Foundation, because after all, if you want to control people and behavior, you always alter their environment around them. That's the first thing you learn in psychological motivation. You must alter the environment, and therefore, how do you alter it? Well, you own the environment, you make the rules for the environment, and then the people will comply and adapt to the new rules until they're eventually adapted all the way into these little habitat areas, which are just, as I say, going to be overcrowded cities for a while until the population is reduced drastically. Remember, we're talking in long-term plans here. We find Charles Galton Darwin, as I say, in his book called The Next Million Years, he said that himself. He says this will take 1,000 years to complete with creating a new type of human being to be a more efficient slave. And he had no problem calling them slaves. He says, we've always had systems of slavery in one form or another, and we're simply making a more efficient one. So they're looking at long-term plans. Now, the war on terror is the main big stick to bring all of these changes for the whole high Masonic agenda, we'll call it, into being. And under this war of terror, we found that guys like Donald Rumsfeld said this might take 100 years. So he's also talking about a complete change in all cultures, all ways of viewing life, a completely new ordered, efficient type of society where no one will be born unless they have a job for you to fulfill, a function for you. You won't be born if they have no need for you. That's what they call efficiency. And they have written about this. Lord Bertrand Russell's also written about it. They all belong to the Royal Institute for International Affairs, all of these players. And we find the Rockefeller family, as I say, since the early 1900s, started up the foundations to pay for all the non-governmental organizations that they would use to push this whole agenda forward, including all the greening type parties.
Unbelievable, and people think with 100,000 plastic water bottles at the grocery store that separating paper from plastic at home is going to give their kids a better future. Ridiculous. But again, it's what's out there, and I think Mr. Alan Watt at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, that guilt is a huge part of it, because so many people out there feel guilty, ignorantly guilty, and want to do little itty-bitty things to try and mitigate some of that guilt. Can you talk about how guilt is used as part of this, just so that people can understand that they can be empowered by not feeling guilty and by just simply looking up and seeing who really guilty people are?
Well, one of the best mentors on this whole thing was Jacques E. Lowell. And Jacques E. Lowell wrote many books. He worked for the big boys himself. He understood mass psychology, and he was going through all the motivation or factors that affect humans, the types of strong drives that can be utilized. But he said at the very end of one chapter in one of his books, he said, don't forget that guilt itself is a fantastic tool. It's also a very strong motivating factor. And so the creation of guilt, that it's your fault. And remember what I said with the book, The First Global Revolution by the Council of the Club of Rome. They said in there that they would convince the public that they were responsible for altering the weather, and they were talking about creating massive guilt complexes through repetitive propaganda and the use of slogans. And Bertrand Russell also chipped in his books and said they would use the same technique with guilt through repetition and slogans just over and over again. And Russell said we shall bring in the biggest marketing companies on board with our organization to market this idea to the public.
Incredible. Yeah, I just saw the cover of Time magazine's new global warming issue, where they called it global warming, had a polar bear on the cover standing on sort of broken ice, even though polar bears can swim. People can Google that, go to SeaWorld.org and see they can swim for 8 hours at a time, 100 kilometers at a time, on and on and on. And all the science is bad for this, but yeah, it's a $15 book put out by Time magazine, which basically nickel and dimes us to death in terms of what we can do to prevent global warming without sort of leading to the sort of end conclusion. The glaciers are melting. How much? The polar bears are dying. Well, how many? I mean, they don't really finish sentences. So can you speak to the propaganda itself and how it's used, and so people understand when they hear something that they need to look for the end of the sentence? Yes,
they really have to switch off. And to be honest with you, and I really mean this, the television is such a powerful tool for propaganda. It's right in your home, and it's when you go from station to station during news time, you'll find the same format with the same topics all playing at the same time. They never vary because they're all coming from a centralized command. They come from routers or the AP wireline, which both belong to MI6. That's who started off routers. And so they give you all the only news you're getting. And they bring on experts. Now, Bertrand Russell said, we shall create a nation, a world, he said, where people will be unable to make any decisions for themselves without expert advice. And that's what we have today. If you flick on the Weather Channel, they'll bring an expert on what clothes to wear for this kind of weather. You know, it's getting that bad, we can't think for ourselves. We're treated like children. But it has worked. Russell even went so far as to say that a mother won't be able to change the diaper on her child without expert advice. Well, that's happened now too. They have courses for this kind of stuff. So they have created the kind of society they said they would, and they were quite confident they could do it with the use of all media, especially television and radio and magazines.
Unbelievable, Mr. Alan Watt from cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Yeah, they've basically erased thousands of years of child-rearing history. Can you talk about that? Can you speak to the effect on the family this has, the planned effect, and of course the evident effect that we can see?
Well, what interested me was communism and capitalism. Again, the dialectic, the two, one or the other. And then I went into the books to find out where the origins came from. And I went past all the usual players that they give you, and it did take me to Albert Pike too, who was the head of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. He was called the Pope of Masonry, and he trained Giuseppe Mazzini, which is just Joseph Mason in Italian, to start off the World Revolutionary Party, and the guy who took over from Mazzini was Lenin. And they're all funded from London and New York, and this is well documented, this kind of stuff, where their funding came from. We know that Trotsky, for instance, was apprehended in Halifax and on his way over for the revolution with suitcases full of money. That's in the Canadian records. We can find them quite easily on a search. So I said, well, why on earth were the capitalist countries funding communism? And then when you went into the writings of H.G. Wells, who was a propagandist for this organization in London, backed by Royal Charter, by the Queen and the King at the time, Wells was picked by Professor Thomas Huxley, the grandfather of Aldous Huxley of Brave New World. And they started what they called the Red Tie School for Revolution under the guidance of Thomas Huxley. And he and other major authors were trained to be authors and propagandists to bring in a form of globalism. And they said in their own writings that they would put the world at loggerheads with each other by creating a left and a right, far left, far right, the apparent opposites. But down the road, about 70 years from then, they would get rid of one of them, which would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they'd merge the two together for a socialized world, a world run again by experts and groups and panels of bureaucrats. That was to be their ideal world. They called it the Third Way. And it was so interesting to see Alvin Toffler. His book was being given out free to all the congressional members in the U.S. by Newt Gingrich. And the book was called The Third Way, the joining of the two systems.
And we're seeing that happen now, I suppose, with respect to communism falling and capitalism sort of dying and globalization being the big key. I mean, for activists out there who are fighting globalization, can you give them any tips?
We have to understand that these characters are not going to change their agenda by begging them. It doesn't happen. And we noticed about 4 years ago, when they had one of their international meetings, they did let some of the top NGO leaders in, and I knew they would eventually, because that's to be the new Soviet. Now remember, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are unelected by the people as well, but here they are getting sort of elected status in a say-so. Well, that's what Soviet meant. The Soviet system was ruled by councils, unelected councils. The only difference being the heads of the NGOs in the Soviet regime were picked by the Politburo. Well, it's no different here. The heads of the NGOs, the top NGOs that are authorized in Canada and the States and Britain, are all selected and paid for and trained, in fact, by the big foundations. They get lifetime salaries. They have banks of computers. They have pension schemes for their employees. These aren't grassroots guys at all.
Unbelievable, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. It seems to me that they built this middle class so that they could exploit us and our labor and our intellect to build them new pyramids, essentially. New pyramids, islands, hotels, nuclear bombs, and everything else that they wanted. But now that we're here in the year 2007, if we wake up, there is a chance where we can use the sort of training we've got, technology we've got, and resources we've got to keep it and say, okay, guys, you got us this far. You didn't keep us completely intellectually bankrupt and dehumanized and sort of, I guess, mindless slaves. You allowed us to express ourselves through art and culture and education and technology. Thanks. Now we're going to keep it. Do you see that possibility today?
What I see today is we could possibly do it with the right people here and there, scattered here and there. But as you see yourself, technology has been dished out piecemeal. Everything we get today is antique and obsolete. And for instance, Nick Begich, who basically was the first guy to come up with the HARP technology being used in the Americas on the public, was on the CBC here on Wendy Mesley's show a few years ago, showing these little gadgets like the size of a television remote, something you could put in your pocket. And he had tablesfuls of these little gadgets, and he said to Wendy, he said, stand 20 feet away, and he pointed it at her. She was facing away from him, and she heard music in the middle of her head. And this was a technique of voice-to-skull technology, very old technology. but he said that he could just as easily have put a voice in her head. Now, he said this is obsolete from the CIA. This technology was from the 1950s. So that tells you, in the 1950s, people were still using the big glass tubes in their TVs and radios. We hadn't had the transistor radio even by then, and the stuff that was in this little handheld had to be solid-state microcircuitry, stuff that we only were given about 10, 15 years ago. So they're so far ahead in levels of science that whatever is presented to the public at the bottom level is already obsolete from a war point of view and is safe to be sold to the public. So since they have us hooked on their technology, whatever they give us, if you notice, for instance, Windows, how come all computers, one day, and I tested this out, one day they were all XP, the very next day every model and make was suddenly Vista. That tells you the coordination. That tells you there's no real competition between the companies. They're all getting their technology from a higher source at the same time, dished out to them. There is no free competition in this area whatsoever. We have the illusion of competition to make us think we're still free, but in reality, we're not. The CEOs, interestingly enough, of these companies, Toshiba and Sony and all the big ones, how come they can leave one company with its 50 years of planning and investments ahead against their competitors? How can they can leave that and go to their competitor the next day and carry on as usual? There is no competition. It's one big club at the top, and the illusion is for our benefit. So they have the control over technology, and they keep upgrading it all the time. They make things obsolete so quickly on our level at the bottom. It'd be very difficult to try and take over for ourselves and say, well, it's our technology now. It'd be very, very difficult to do.
Right. It seems like they have generations of stuff in the can, and they just release it on schedule.
Exactly. That's exactly what they do. And a Path News, an old Path News reel from World War II, just after D-Day, one of the most famous commentators, war correspondents from the U.S., was filming one of the beaches, and he said, you'll never guess how this is being transmitted to the States. And then the big camera panned away and showed them holding this little phone with a screen on it, which was a cell phone with a camera on it. He said, shortly everyone's going to have one of these. That was 1945.
Wow, incredible. And Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com, just for people who don't know about HARP technology, you mentioned the effects Nick Begich demonstrated on Wendy Mesley. Can you explain how, I've heard you mention before that they've turned up the HARP waves 24/7, and you can actually hear them on shortwave radio. So can you describe that, name the frequency, and describe the effects they have on us?
Yeah, well, the HARP technology, and you'll find this in the treaty to do with weather warfare at the United Nations. Do a search on that from the 1970s. And in there, they went through all the things that HARP could do. HARP technology, high altitude auroral research program. They bounce off high standing waves off the ionosphere and can triangulate them down to anywhere they want in the Americas, or abroad for that matter. But one of the side effects of it, apart from creating hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, or floods, was also that they could manipulate the minds or the moods of the general public by putting on a secondary wave, on the carrier wave. They could zone in on the same brain frequencies as the human brain falls into, and they could either elevate the mood and make you very happy, even when you shouldn't be, perhaps under the circumstances, or make you very depressed, or make you tremendously tired. They could, if they wanted to, they could make everyone hear voices in their head at the same time, stuff like that. And that's all in the treaty that was signed at the United Nations.
Amazing. So the details were discussed there. These treaties are huge. I know the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs is 22,000 pages and 385 pounds, according to Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, who wasn't even criticizing it, just sort of found it amusing. So in these treaties, just so people get this clear, the details of what this technology can do, are they outlined?
Yes, oh yeah, they're outlined, and the basic things that they can do, the earthquakes, the hurricanes, creating hurricanes and tornadoes and steering them to their target. That's old stuff, because that was signed as a treaty, not something that was still to come. creating droughts. They could kill off the farmers and get rid of them by creating droughts or flood, one or the other. And as I say, earthquakes or tsunamis. It's all old stuff now. It's child's play. And this is a very old technology, as I say, going back to Tesla. And even before Tesla, there was some experimentation going on in the late 1800s by scientists.
Amazing. These are all the attacks on us from all sorts of angles. Let's talk about chemtrails, which I guess might work in conjunction with HAARP technology to suppress dissent, make us docile and happy in the face of growing fascism. Can you speak to those? Because they've been, even in the sort of conspiracy street cred world, they've sort of been something that people have been afraid to touch for one reason or another.
Yeah. And, well, it's an old story. Again, going back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, he said that the public won't think about anything unless the media tells them to, and that's happened, unfortunately. They can get us talking trivia forever, but if they don't mention something that's major, we ourselves, even if we see it, will tend to disregard it. That's how easily this thing works. We're trained that way. And these trails, these chemtrails, have been going on steadily across Canada since 1997, 1998. And if we go into the history of what they could be, and now I know what's in the ones I've analyzed, at least with the chemical compounds. I don't know about drugs or whatever, which has also been discussed at higher levels. But aluminum oxide is one of the main ingredients in these trails carried to Earth by the polymer. That's the bluish haze that you see forming up there. These were initially invented by Teller. Teller was the father of the H-bomb. And he wanted to spray this stuff across whole continents, maybe the world if necessary, and then by the use of tiny metallic particles in the atmosphere, they could create, the atmosphere would become a tremendous circuit, and they could use HAARP pulsed scalar technology as a weapon across the whole planet that would affect people's moods, make them very compliant and docile. Which is also one of the side effects of the aluminum oxide and the other things within, because the same stuff as fluoride, in fact, is aluminum oxide. And using this pulsating wave, they could put you into a very tired mode or a very aggressive mode. Now, the people of Maine were some of the first people to be tested by the U.S. government on this. They didn't know they were under observation. All police stations, social work departments, hospitals were all wired to computers, so to central computers to the Pentagon, so they could study the effects over a few months of exposure to the HAARP technology along with the spraying. And they found that domestic animals were becoming unruly, they'd bite their masters, even cattle were running away, and cows were running away at milking time. Violence went sky high, and then they tried a different frequency, and everyone became compliant and complacent and laid back. And then when they went to another frequency, their suicide shot up 70% of what it had been over the last 20 years. So
and this is all documented, Mr. Watt?
Yeah. The people of Maine, when they found out, put a lawsuit in that went all the way, I believe, to the Supreme Court. Now, I don't know what the outcome is. But, however, check out what happened here in Canada at Espanola in Ontario. They were getting sprayed every day from the skies by aircraft coming even lower. They were coming across the Great Lakes. And if the first symptoms they found around Espanola were of deer having stillbirths all over the place, over the forest. And then they started to find the women in Espanola were having the same problem after pregnancy. They were having stillbirths. And the people coming down with different kinds of sicknesses, bronchial problems, pneumonias, and so on. And they took it through the Ontario court system. They went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, where it was admitted, yes, you are being sprayed, but the Canadian Air Force isn't responsible, because the Canadian government had made a deal with the U.S. that the U.S. would do it for them. That's documented.
Well, it seems to me, even though it's a tough challenge, that it's up to our Air Force to defend our skies and shoot anybody who sprays us, but they're abrogating that responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But that's documented. And then check into the 1948 spraying of Winnipeg by flying fortresses, another deal the U.S. government made with Canada, and they sprayed the city of Winnipeg for a month, every day for a month at low level, with some substances. I think even cadmium was in there. and then they followed the people down through their lives, through their health records, which is easy with a socialist system. That's also in the book by Don Scott from Sudbury.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I heard we played the interview this morning here on CKLN Radio about Don Scott, Sudbury MP, who mentioned this in Parliament and then was told not to. But any other examples of courageous Canadians standing up to this?
Not too many. Most of the groups in Canada are simply fighting party politics, to be honest with you. Again, it takes an individual to get out of the groupthink and to start speaking their own thoughts, their own observations, what they've learned and what they see around them. But no, there's not. Unfortunately, the groupthink is encouraged in Canada. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke to a friend who's kind of aware of these issues in the North American Union and other horrible things like that, and yet he still joined the Liberal Party because he just wants, to be with. Even when I asked him about his reasoning, it basically came down to, safe, more familiar, not conservatives. Can you speak to how the parties are used? I mean, what are the broader themes they're pushing so that maybe we can resist when we see more of their BS coming down the pike?
Well, in my lifetime, it doesn't matter what country I've been in, I've seen many changes in parties, who gets in, who comes out. I always say that we don't vote a party in. We're just so disgusted with the last lot, we vote them out, and that's what happens in democracy. We're so sick of the corruption and all the rest of it. There's only one agenda. There's only one agenda, and Professor Carroll Quigley put this very, very well in his book, Tragedy and Hope. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations. He had all their records and their agenda, and he was all for it. He tells you at the beginning of his book that he was all for it. Plus, you got to read the Anglo-American Establishment by the same man. Now, he picked men like Bill Clinton to become Rhodes Scholars for world government. That's what the Rhodes Scholarship is for. And he said, it doesn't matter. He says, we encourage the party politics. He says, we allow a certain amount of competition at the bottom end of either party. He said, but we always put our own men in at the top. He says, that's all we need. And that's how it has been. And he says in that book, he says, for the last 50 years, there's been a parallel government running the show called the Council on Foreign Relations in America and the Royal Institute for International Affairs in the British Commonwealth countries. Now, that book was published in the 1960s.
Mr. Watt, how does this integrate with this sort of private central banking cabal? We're speaking a lot about foundations. I mean, how did they integrate?
They integrated a long time ago when the British elite brought over the Rothschilds. In fact, the Rothschilds didn't come into Britain and just play a good bet and take over the Bank of England. They were brought over because they were better managers of the system. And we find again, going back into the writings of Lord Bertrand Russell in books like The Impact of Science on Society, we find that he said we must bring on board, he says, the men who understand economics and long-term economics and populations. And he meant the global bankers. And he said it doesn't matter, he said, what we have is money as long as the people accept it as money. That's the first big con job, is money itself. It comes between the people who barter for a bag of oats and a bag of barley, and the guy who ends up convincing you this money is worth the same amount ends up running both. So it's a con game, the whole aspect of money. And the big bankers, all they do to the banks, like the Bank of Canada, which isn't a bank, as you know, it's not in the blue pages. It's just a floor of a building where a bunch of them meet together and they are representatives of the lenders, these 13 banking families that lend checks to the world, which allows us to print up paper, but we must pay these bankers back with real goods. Isn't that a great deal? That's all it is. That's the scam right there. They give us a check so we can print off Canadian dollars, but we must pay them back with interest in real goods. What a deal.
Unbelievable, absolutely, and I think it's very important, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com, that our listeners understand this, because we do appear headed towards a global depression, recession, whatever you want to call it, collapse of the financial system. I remember I grew up in Toronto, born and raised here, and my parents always told me, keep good credit, you need good credit to get a home loan. And yet a couple of years ago, the bank said, nah, don't worry about it, you know, you don't need good credit. We can introduce subprime mortgages as sort of one last big cash grab and pair of financial handcuffs. And as a corollary to that, a friend told me just yesterday that a girl in her 20s that he knows just got a 45-year mortgage.
Oh.
Yeah, I've never heard of one of those. Shocking stuff. So can you speak to what Canadians should think about instead of accepting this system of debt and money as obvious with respect to keeping what we have? Because I'd hate to see a bunch of us lose our homes and condos.
To be honest with you, we're going anyway down the road, because the United Nations has stated in its treaty, the Biodiversity Treaty. Now, Maurice Strong from Canada was the guy who spearheaded this. People got to go into it and check that out carefully. The United Nations has said in the Agenda 21, that's Agenda for the 21st century, the whole new way of living that they're going to pull off within the next 50 to 100 years maximum. Gradualism, remember, it's done through gradualism. And they said at the end of this, there'll be no private property anywhere. There'll be rental accommodation only owned by the state. There'll be no private transportation. There'll be essential vehicles only. This is all in Agenda 21. Find that at the United Nations website. I also have it on my website. I downloaded the whole lot a while ago in case they took it off theirs. But that's what's being promoted. That's what Al Gore and all these boys are all about, and Maurice Strong are all about. And Maurice Strong, remember, too, has been a big player in this whole movement towards owning the environment. That means all land, etc., for the big foundations. It was Rockefeller that picked him up initially and set him up and then put him into the United Nations. Here's the tie-in with these characters. Maurice Strong, interestingly enough, on a Sunday afternoon when it was pouring rain, and I did turn on the television, shame on me, but I looked at the public broadcasting, and there's a documentary on about Maurice Strong. Where is he now? Now, this is the guy, remember, that Bob Rae pulled in from the United Nations, set him up at the head of Ontario Hydro, and he was the man that ended up setting up the process to privatize the hydro industry for electricity across Ontario. And then when they found out he was still getting a salary from the Rockefeller Foundation and the United Nations, and is not supposed to do that when he takes a salary from the Ontario people, he decided to stay on for $1 a month until it was completed. But he also said that they were going to put big generators into all big plants, factories, and office buildings for what's coming down the pike in the near future. Well, that was the early 90s. He was talking about that. They knew darn well they were going to start bringing down all energy consumption back then, and starting with brownouts to train us that everything's just falling to pieces, and to get us used to consuming less energy, and once again to force people into the overcrowded city areas where they'll put on special grid lines, etc., to keep it all going. This is how they have to train us. So Maurice Strong is a big player, and on this afternoon documentary, it's just, where is he now? Well, he was over in Beijing, China, working at a United Nations building that they'd built for him. The United Nations had built for him to do with free trade and bringing the commerce from China over to the Americas. And while they were doing the documentary, they followed him to a graveyard in Beijing to visit his aunt, who was buried next to Mao Zedong, and it said right on the gravestone, beloved friend of Mao Zedong and chief advisor.
Wow, one of the greatest mass murderers in human history.
For communism, yeah. And here he is, a guy who was picked up by the top capitalists, the Rockefeller family, and put to the top. They ran both sides, you see.
Unbelievable, and yet most Canadians today, I know there's an election coming up on October 10th in Ontario, are threatened with budget cuts and bribed with false promises. And in a country, Mr. Watt, of only 30 million people, the population of Mexico City, that has the second largest land mass in the world, it seems to me that we should never be short of anything.
There's no reason for it. I've got old school books here that were given to children about the age of 7 or 8 in Canada. And some of them are on the oil in Canada. And they show you from 1918, 1920, they show you all hundreds of uncapped or capped wells across Ontario alone that had never been used, just capped for future use. None of them have been opened up yet.
And yet gas is rising. Can you quickly debunk peak oil, just so that we can get that one out of the way?
Well, it's absolute rot. I mean, all they've told us about oil is so much rot, to be honest. All the stuff about the dinosaurs made the oil, and yet you look at the charts from British Petroleum and Esso and all the big companies from, again, the early 1920s on to the 1950s, and they show you what they call the oil tree and how oil really is made by rotting vegetation, collecting annually and going down and down and down. It's a continuing process, but I do know, because I used to travel across the North Sea often, because I used to play all across Europe and Scandinavia, and I talked to many of the guys who were drilling in the oil rigs across the North Sea, and at that time that the head of British Petroleum told me that they'd found so much oil at that time already, and they still had a vast areas to explore, to supply the entire world for the next 150 years, just from that one find.
Unbelievable. Yeah, it strikes me, Mr. Alan Watt at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, that they wouldn't gamble on oil being one of their main control mechanisms if they didn't have a lot.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And they already, again, are so far ahead of all the oil. We know that during World War II, the whole Nazi war machine, which is run and owned really by IG Farben, an umbrella company, again owned by Rockefellers, Rothschilds, and other, and even Baxter Labs of Canada were in on IG Farben, but they were making synthetic oil, and they also had other oil they extracted from coal, and we have vast amounts of coal here. They were also making the tires for their vehicles from the same substance. And that the patents for that after World War II were bought over by, again, the Rockefellers.
Unbelievable. And you're working exceptionally hard on exposing these. For what reason, Mr. Watt? And I only say that because to me it seems like the elite get power by keeping secrets, and we the people get power by exposing them, as opposed to playing in their reality and simply begging the government for table scraps. So what is the, I mean, when they run these massive frauds on us, taxing us for exhaling CO2, is that to convince people on the inside, look, we got the sheeple, keep sticking with the system?
I think why I do this personally is because I grew up in a nation that had centuries and centuries of wars for something called the British Empire. And I was brought up in a one-roomed apartment that had been condemned and closed 100 years before, which they'd opened up after World War II because they'd failed to give the public what they'd promised during World War I and II, and that was public housing. Most folk in Britain, remember, did not have property. It was a remnant of the old feudal system. Most people were basically peasants who rented. And I thought, after hundreds and hundreds of centuries of looting and plundering across the planet, how is it only about 200-odd families or 300 families in London own anything? And that's when I went to my research, and I looked at all the people working really hard in the mines and all the rest of it. And yet I knew the economy was fixed. You could go from north to south of Britain, and you get the same starting wages as an apprentice for any job, the same starting wages for any trade or a miner or whatever, and ultimately you got an ultimate full pay, which would never really increase. And I really realized we're under a wages and price fix at that time. And I realized, my God, look at the incredible control when they can actually stop all free competition. If there was free competition of any kind, you would have a variety of starting wages and top wages for the same jobs. So I realized that it was not meant for people to get extra money that they could save up and use. When I was young, everybody argued, every couple argued, your parents argued, their friends argued about paying the rent, having enough to pay the rent. They didn't have credit cards. They didn't have the illusion of having lots because there was no credit cards allowed unless you had property. And so what I'm doing this for is for all those that have gone before me, never knowing the scams that were going on, the present bunch who are going through it, and mainly for the young ones up and coming who are going to get the worst of it as we go through the worst changes yet to come. Because these characters at the top mean what they say. They mean that they want to reduce the population. They want to indoctrinate the youth into wanting body chips for ID purposes, right down to even a brain chip, ultimately. That was discussed at Loyola University meeting for the last 2 or 3 years, the World Science meetings. They have a brain chip that they want to implant in people, and they said the only problem they have now is to convince the public to accept it. And so they're going to promote it as giving you, it being better than drugs. It will stimulate your brain to secrete certain chemicals which will make you feel better and so on. And of course they're selling it through movies to the youngsters because all the superheroes have brain chips now. They really want this to be accomplished, and to allow this horror to go on, including what I mean by horror, I mean they have been attacking us physically. People today are getting arthritis in their 20s, and even adolescent arthritis. These are side effects from inoculations. The autism used to be incredibly rare and started very early on. Now it doesn't start to the age of 2 when they have their measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines given to them, and then they come down with autism. And it's skyrocketed. The graphs are there from the medical associations themselves, in fact, and you'll see that the spike going up in line with the amount of inoculations being given out. They're actually doing what Charles Galton Darwin proposed that they do, and that was to knock out in the West. And they had global meetings on this. Remember, the United Nations and the World Health Organization, Doctor Who, as I like to call it, has a department of population control. And I say to people, what do you think population control means? They don't employ thousands of experts and doctors to sit on their hands and make a wish list. They're actually doing it. And Galton, Darwin, and others proposed that they inject certain things into the people of the West, which would make them ineligible for marriage partners because they'd be sickly and weak, and they would also sterilize them. Well, look at the sperm count of the average Western male. Since 1950, it is now down by 75%. So the Western male is 75% sterile today. That doesn't happen in nature suddenly, and the United Nations gives out these statistics every year, doesn't make a comment on it. Now, if this is happening by itself, by some weird thing happening, they would call it a crisis. But they don't. They just give us the statistics and leave it at that. There's no comment on it. That tells you that they're actually doing what they said to do. Now, Africa, they said they would take down quickly because the Africans, on the whole, would not adapt to the Western economic system, and therefore they'd have no place in it. And the top economists for the British Crown and the Crown corporations of Britain in the 1800s, John Stuart Mill, and then his son that took over as the top economist, both said the same thing in their own writings. They would eventually eliminate most of the Africans quickly, and they would bring down the population of the American Indians because they would also be unable to adapt to this economic system, and no one would come through that was not able to adapt and have a purpose within this economic system.
Now, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com, when you say they're unable to adapt, is this racism, or is there some other sort of cultural, I guess, practices that would make it incompatible with accepting the capitalist democracy?
I think it's basically the cultural difference. They have a totally different culture in some of these countries. H.G. Wells, you'll find, also printed this in his non-fictional work called A History of the World. It's in 2 volumes, part 1 and 2. He put out the list long before Adolf Hitler of the races that would come through because it would be essential to it. They'd work towards for the system. But he'd put down the blacks, the American Indians, who just wouldn't go along with the concept of working for this thing called money, which they hadn't needed up until now. They could live very well, thank you very much. And it was an alien thought for them to buy and sell land, for instance. They couldn't comprehend this strange idea. And they would be unable to adapt to an 8 to 5 or an 8 to 8 even work system. And Jordan Stuart Mill had published that in the 1800s, and his son published a book after that on the same theme. And they were the top economists for the British corporations at the time.
And economics is a fraud?
Oh, yeah. I can remember a Man Alive program in Britain. It was very good, and they were talking to top ex-professors of economics who one by one came out and said that was utter nonsense. You're better with a Ouija board or rolling dice, because it was a total fraud, yeah.
Unbelievable. Are there any countries, Mr. Watt, that are outside of this system? I know that in the circles that I sort of look at and travel in, there's theories that Russia might be outside it, that Iran might be outside it, North Korea. Are there any countries you see that are not part of the, I guess, as Brzezinski said, the grand chessboard?
The countries that he mentions in that book, in fact, are the ones that were outside of it. That's why he said they'd eventually have wars with them. And the New American Century, the project for a New American Century, the club of Wolfowitz, Pearl, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the Bushes and all the rest of them belonged to before they got into this present regime. They published in the 1990s that they'd have to go to war, first with Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Iran, then Syria, in that order. And sure enough, the same bunch now got into politics, and they started off the ball rolling in 2001. On that very same agenda. Brzezinski came out with his grand chessboard about the same time, with the same countries all lined up. So the Middle Eastern countries, the Muslim countries, they remember, don't use usury. They don't have central banking systems. They don't borrow from the world bankers. They're outside of it. Now, Yugoslavia and Bosnia was the same way. They did not go along with the World Bank. They didn't join it until the UN bombed them out of existence. And now it's a turn for the Middle East to be standardized as well. What they're creating is standardization across the whole world. Yeah.
Unbelievable, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. That's all the macro stuff. If you wouldn't mind a word to the micro for the youth out there especially, I'm noticing all the boys are being trained to shoot mindlessly like good little soldiers, lining up at midnight for Halo 3 at Best Buy, and all the girls, the magazines are saying, make your hair shiny, make your ass tiny. And I'll be damned if it's working. It's been a great summer in Toronto for checking out girls, but I'm afraid that the lack of other motivation towards learning about the world and our environment may catch up with all of us in a minute. So can you speak to how they've been historically socialized and sort of what you see currently as the attacks on them?
Well, again, going back into techniques of warfare preparation, but now we're dealing with people who plan in centuries, and that's the hard thing for most folk to come to grips with. We like to think of starting a project and seeing it finished in our lifetime. We forget the big foundations and governments, the diplomatic service, for instance, work in centuries towards particular goals. But for creating war, they said a long time ago they would bring in technologies. By that they meant video games, which would basically, which were designed for the military only. The average person, even in the military, when they join, they're unable to kill right off the bat. And so they have to be desensitized to it through special programs, so they'll kill quickly without thinking. And they came out with the video games about 30-odd years ago, and they had huge machines at those times to train military personnel. The governments and the Pentagon also put money towards making miniature forms of the same technologies to aim at the youth. And believe you me that nothing happens in culture unless the big boys allow it to happen or want it to happen. And therefore, this was promoted from the top. The whole video game scenario was promoted, heavily funded, and promoted from the top down. They wanted to raise a generation starting about 20 years ago, because they knew that in 2001, that's when they'd start their project for a New American Century. And they wanted a generation who would be hooked on games and see killing just like a game. And they also started to withdraw forms of individual thinking from the schools in a big way. I think the books by Gatto on exposing the educational system are excellent, well documented too, on how they would regiment the school systems into groupthink and discourage individualistic thinking. That's happened. So here you have people who are already trained to be parts of the group. The first thing you're taught in the military is you belong, you're special, you belong here, you're one of us. So you're already conditioned to that group mentality and obeying orders from the group leader, and you're desensitized. Also by even the music they've been promoting for years now, you're desensitized. You're almost turned into, I hate to say it, but a form of barbarian. I can remember seeing the troops on the decks of the aircraft carriers as they were going towards the Gulf, and they all had their shirts off, and they were doing rap dancing on the deck. And I thought, my God, we're sending barbarians in to one of the oldest civilizations on the planet.
Unbelievable, yeah. And Gandhi asked, when asked what do you think of Western civilization, he replied it would be a good idea. But I heard something you said about that. What I'd just like to clarify right now before we get back to this: was he or was he not a free agent working for the Indian people?
I don't think so, because an old technique in the British diplomatic corps, and you'll find this even in movies that were put out, a few movies that were put out, one by Marlon Brando, called Burn. It showed you how the diplomatic corps worked on countries and long-term goals by giving heroes to the public for them to follow, often by using someone who's well-known, making him fall from grace because he's chosen the side of the people or whatever, imprison him. That always gets the public to think he's one of us, and then releasing him, he becomes the leader. And Gandhi himself, initially, when he was locked up by the British police or military, so was his wife, and they both came down with pneumonia while in the cells. Gandhi eventually caved in and disobeyed his Hindu laws and said, okay, I'll accept the antibiotics, I want to live. But he forbade his wife to take antibiotics to save her life. That shows you something about the man right there. And he did other things too. He'd always sleep with an 18-year-old virgin every night to prove that he wasn't tempted. But Britain, remember, had tried to unify India. That was not a huge country. What I mean, it wasn't a unified country at that time. And they tried for decades to get one tribe fighting another towards unification, because out of war, conflict, you have synthesis, and then you start off the next role with the next bunch you aren't in until you own the whole country. They knew this would take a long, long time to do, so they had to give a hero to the public to do it. And so Gandhi helped to almost unify the country and save them decades of work.
Unbelievable, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. It seems to me that all of our heroes, I mean, there's a Gideon Bible in every hotel room in the world.
Yeah.
The New World Order wouldn't put them there if, I mean, they wouldn't allow that to happen if they didn't want it to happen. But is there a way to identify with the values of some of these people, say the icon of peace of the 20th century who we look to? I mean, people say to me right now, where's the new Gandhi? We need a new Gandhi. And it's like, to find out that everybody we've heard of has basically been part of a lie is one thing, but also, in my opinion, and maybe you can speak on this with your experience, it is the values that they need to sell us that I think we can relate to. So, for instance, Jesus, the Prince of Peace, turn the other cheek, forgive the whores, beat the moneylenders, done.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can use all those things.
Yeah.
And today we have heroes like Dexter, the blood splatter expert who also kills people, and they say, good or evil, you decide.
Yeah.
So they're destroying our values right now so that we can't even use those to pick our heroes, but in the past we could. So is there a way to sort of recognize, regardless of how they were used, the values that we related to that made us like them and made us humans?
Yeah, well, when again, guys like H.G. Wells were trained initially by Thomas Huxley, and a whole bunch of revolutionaries actually were trained by Huxley. They said that the first thing they had to do was encourage free love. Now, this is in the 1800s, not in the 1960s. They said that to promote free love, because the earlier they could start children having sex, the less likely they would be to bond with anyone down the road. And they tried this in the 1920s when they brought in the booze can houses after creating prohibition, and made them very exciting places to go for the young, quite naturally so. And they brought in the miniskirt with the Charlton dance and all that. They brought in cocaine as well. The Bronfmans in Canada ran the whole booze industry and the cocaine industry down into the U.S. And but even at that, they didn't have the pill, the birth control pill. They didn't have antibiotics for venereal diseases, and so there was too much of a fallout. They couldn't swing it off. So they put so much money after that to work with science to find a way of birth control and penicillins, etc., that came out of it, and then introduced the same thing, miniskirts, music, cocaine, drugs, in the 1960s to try and start the whole thing off again. And they knew at the time that what's the best way of reducing the population? Well, you get the people to start reducing it themselves through abortion. Without the vast promiscuity, you wouldn't have the side effects or the outcome of it, you see. Create the problem, give the solution. That's the oldest technique in the book. And this particular topic is explained by Lord Bertrand Russell, as I say, a key member and player in all of this kind of stuff, in his book, The Impact of Science on Society. He said eventually women will think that they won their rights by themselves. They'll never guess that they were given to them by us. He said they will think they're free, but in fact they've simply joined the men in their form of slavery.
Amazing. Mr. Alan Watt at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. I'd like to get to him. We discussed men being turned into savage soldiers and heading off to the Middle East to destroy a culture they really don't know anything about. Mm-hmm. But women, I've got a soft spot for women. I can see how they've been socialized. I can see that they're told to look for balance and never achieve it because it's impossible. I mean, guys just do stuff, whereas women are given all sorts of problems and little tricks of the trade to fool them into thinking they're inadequate and failing at life as opposed to just doing life and maybe taking a chance to enjoy it. So the specific attacks on women that you've seen historically from the Nazi era or before that to today.
Yeah, well, again, too, World War II, for instance, they knew that World War II was coming. The Royal Institute for International Affairs wrote about coming. I have the minutes of their meetings from the books that they published for their members at the time. And they said that when the men are gone, we shall promote the women into the factories to get them in full-time employment. This ties in again with the next million years by Charles Galton Darwin, or Galton Darwin, where he said that if they can get women in the workplace competing with men and giving them good salaries, he says, then that they're less likely to get married and have children. They'd rather have a car or own something. So by using physical, materialistic incentives, they hoped that they'd separate male and female, so they're both running after the material goods they could purchase. And he said, well, shall also create an egocentric society, a society who's taught they're supposed to be happy all the time, and that will aim 90% of all our advertising at the female population. And that's why if you look in any store with the magazines, 90-odd% of the magazines are aimed at women. You open any of them up, they'll tell you, it's all by experts. This is what kind of sex you're supposed to have. This is what kind of lifestyle you're supposed to have. This is what kind of house you're supposed to be able to afford. It's all telling them how they're supposed to be. They're not allowed to be themselves. They're constantly being told they're supposed to be something else, something different, something better. They're unattainable. Meanwhile, their instincts still are at work. Everyone wants bonding. They want to feel they belong somewhere with someone. And yet the whole of society, the movies you watch, the soap operas on television, all that stuff is to make you dissatisfied with any partner you could possibly meet. Same with the men. The men are constantly looking at these young babes you see all the time. Look at any series on television, which is primarily to do with hospitals, because that's a big control factor, is the health industry, cops, detectives, and law courts. That's another part of the control factor, you see. And the actors they're picking are about 20, 21, 22, playing the parts of professional, hardened detectives or specialist doctors, which is impossible in real life. So we're also always looking for youth. And at the other end of the spectrum, they said that they would separate the generations. So the elderly, the ones that used to have wisdom to pass on to their grandchildren, are out of the picture altogether. They've successfully separated the genders and the generations as well from each other.
Well, absolutely, Mr. Alan Watt from cuttingthroughthematrix.com. I mean, this is endemic in the society I see living here in Toronto, a very cosmopolitan city. And I've talked to guys about this, and women, frankly, and with their lack of interest in sort of, I guess, in quotes, getting political, which is almost a dirty word today, or understanding what's going on, guys are not prepared to screw it up. I mean, they want to get laid, so
Yep.
you're not going to say anything that's going to upset them, so you're not going to talk about anything heavy. You're going to keep it light and fluffy and give them a break from the daily drudgery they go through. And yet, is there a way to see getting political, in quotes, that dirty word that girls, I mean, absolutely shut down? Guys sometimes will still give you a fight, run for your money with whatever crappy history or media they consume. But is there a way to use getting political or learning what's happening or being aware of the growing fascism and fighting it as a way of self-help that beats the failing self-help that's out there?
Absolutely. The stuff that's already set out for the public is a red herring, or it'll bring you back into the fold from a different direction. The whole idea is to get you back in the system, thinking the way of the system. And I always think of psychiatry, which is a big tool in this whole thing. If you go through the history of psychiatry, it was involved in eugenics from the beginning. They truly believed if they could destroy those who were the carriers of recessive genes, they would destroy all what they called mental illness. Now remember, mental illness at times, like during the fascist era, if you were anything but a fascist, you were called mentally ill. During the Soviet era, they had psychiatric disorders for dissenters, just for dissenting. So we have to be very careful with these industries, and we've got to remember that these are the industries now that are in control of the marketing companies. They use psychology, psychiatry to put opinions and ideas right across into your mind in the absolute knowledge that you will eventually emulate what you see. We mimic what we see on television, we mimic what we see in movies, and that's again going all the way back to Plato, who understood the culture creation industry in his day, 2,300 odd years ago. Plato and the Republic went through the necessities, how to control whole populations by upgrading their culture. He said culture never comes from the grassroots. If it did, he said that we, the elite aristocracy, would lose control. Therefore, whatever culture is given to the public is authorized and given to the lower orders by us. And he says we use the fashion, he called it industry, by the way, the fashion industry, and he said the music industry and the drama industry. He said because the young will emulate what they see on stage. They will sing the songs that they hear on stage, and they'll start to dress in the fashions they see on stage. Everything in culture, unfortunately, is given to us. That's the sad truth. So we have to decide what is innate to human nature. And if we go into human nature, you'll find that belonging, certainly, we are gregarious types of beings. We come from ancient tribal societies, so we do need some form of interpersonal relationships, but we also have this need to bond to perpetuate the species as well, and hopefully to pick your partner to do it with. That's an innate need in people, and so we have women and men today who are being brainwashed and constantly bombarded with opposing information, telling them to just be a stud if you're a guy and just go around from one to the other. And a lot of the women are trying to emulate that too, but deep within themselves, you can't break an instinct through propaganda. All you can do is cause a form of neurosis through suppression. You will suppress certain parts of your nature, but if you suppress certain parts of your nature, they'll only emerge in other parts. You can't keep it down. And again, going back to Professor Carroll Quigley's book, now being the head historian of the Council on Foreign Relations, remember, he said in that book, Tragedy and Hope, he said, an astonishing thing is occurring today. He said, suddenly the youth are mating with each other, even amongst friends, they're having promiscuity and remaining friends afterwards. And he said the women are emulating the men in the way they walk, the way that they talk, and in their behavior. And he doesn't comment too far on that, except to say this is an astonishing thing has occurred. You tie that into, as I say, Charles Galton, Darwin, and other writers who talked about using hormonal inoculations that would affect hormones and so on, and you start wondering, were they actually doing this at the time to make this behavior occur? We find Carl Jung, the psychiatrist as well, who worked with Freud, talking about the same thing. He said, it's interesting to notice, and this is the late 1950s, he says, that the American women are leading this change, he said, by walking like men. They've lost their eros, they're losing their eros, and their pride in having eros and being different. So the main thing that made us so different from each other, which is the complementary aspect of each other when you get together, was being lost. And the women were adapting and beginning to look and talk and walk like the men. What caused that to happen? It wasn't just the fact they were emulating what they saw in the movies. I think there's been big tampering in the hormonal levels, like Charles Galton Darwin talked about in his book.
Absolutely, and as tribal creatures, I mean, I think one man's love might be enough to sustain a woman. I know I've had girlfriends. I'm sort of over a few on getting married in terms of getting that close with them. But when that is absent, they would seek to emulate men. I mean, there's a study done in the United States about promiscuity on high school or college campuses where women were basically saying they were getting drunk and sleeping with someone and not expecting to ever see them or hear from them again. Mm-hmm. And they said it was better to do that than to not be noticed at all. So could this be a way of them sort of trying to get more male attention by emulating male behavior?
I think it's that, and it's also the fact that they want to be honest with you, they all want to be accepted by their own group, and there's a lot of pressure, peer pressure, amongst women, as the same as men, to belong and do the same as everyone else seems to be doing. Whether they really are or not, you don't know. But you want to be the same. Everyone wants to conform. People, again, in the society have been encouraged not to be an individual in any way at all. You're encouraged not to have standards which are innate. Any standards that you have are given to you through moral relativism, which has been the main teaching for the last 30 years. There's no right or wrong in anything. Evil is just a human evaluation on a particular type of outcome. This is so morality, innate morality, has been kicked out the window in massive indoctrination through scientific technique, and that's the key to it. Scientific technique has been used through the educational system to create this kind of mindset in male and female, coupled with the massive Hollywood industry and music industry.
Absolutely, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. I'm even seeing the big bug-eyed sunglasses as a problem, which I see everywhere, in the sense that it seems like people are basically wearing masks when they walk by each other, and there isn't sort of eye contact communication. I try and make it as much as possible when I'm not wearing sunglasses. And how do we replace this on a micro level? It seems to me that if we trust each other more than governments and corporations, we're halfway there. Are there any values that we are aware of, that we have been made aware of, that can counteract the biggest socialization tools hurting us towards conformity in global government?
The tools really are still innate within us. We know during national disasters, which have been natural in the past, at least the ones that we know of, which are still natural, people really do come to the fore, and they really help each other, because by helping others, you are saving the species in a sense. You definitely are saving the species, so we all become very human when we have to. We can really go overboard and help anyone that's there and do amazing things in the process. It's only when we're back to this Sovietized socialist system that we emulate the old Soviet era, where no one could look at each other in the street in case, they pick up your wrong thinking or whatever it happened to be, or speech crime or whatever, according to Orwell. That's what they've encouraged to happen here. We become depersonalized, we become introverted, we are taught to be egocentric in behavior, always look on the bright side of things for yourself personally, and you don't care about the guy next to you or the guy who's lying in the ditch down there. That's been encouraged in this society, along with the whole New Age movement that was brought forward from London again, and created from London and promoted from London, from Aleister Crowley onwards, with the drug industry, etc. They've been promoting this whole thing about don't look at the bad side of life. And so if anyone's suffering, just look somewhere else and be happy. This has been encouraged across the board, to the extent that people have lost their ability for survival. If you don't look at the negative things as well, then you are losing your ability for self-preservation. Life is not meant to be one happy high buzz from birth to death. That's called perpetual immaturity. Experiencing all sides of the emotional spectrum, that's what makes you truly human and mature.
Absolutely, Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. You mentioned egocentonic, and I do see a lot of this egocentonic selfishness, partly from listening to your work. It seems like they want us to sort of be walking through a mall and have, a half a dozen guys in black uniforms, black bag one of us and haul us off, and the rest not care.
Yeah.
How close do you think we are to the point where we don't even care about friends and family? And I only say this so that you can put out a warning to people to sort of start acting right and start looking at your neighbors like they're your friends.
Well, I take a lot of advice really from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He talked about the Soviet system. He was in the Gulag archipelago, and he mentioned what happened in the Soviet system. He says, when under national security the KGB first came into streets and started dragging off your neighbors, they made it the law that the whole street had to be turned out to witness it. In other words, you were meant to be terrified by watching your neighbors pulled off to the Gulag, never to be seen again, under the guise of national security and peace and safety for all. And he said that is the only time we could have stopped it. He said it was at the very beginning. And he said we should have grabbed the pickaxe handles and anything we could get our hands on and clubbed those 2 or 3 guys into the ground. He says, but once you allow things to start happening, he said the neighbors will rationalize that, well, we knew them for years, but they must have done something wrong. They must have deserved it. That's how we have to rationalize things when we live in terror. And unfortunately, through the use of terror, which is what the big boys have agreed to use, because in a globalized system, when there's no threats from an external force anymore, you have to find terror within. You have to find the scapegoats within. The Soviet system did the same once they had put up along the Iron Curtain. They had to turn their sights and find terrorists within their country, so anybody could be a terrorist, and that's what kept them going, fear and terror. It gives an obedient, compliant population. People are just terrified of saying anything that they even observe themselves to any friend in case it gets back to the authorities, and that's what's been encouraged here. I've looked at all the laws that were put on the books after 9/11. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but Canada put them on the books in 1998. It was an omnibus crime bill put through by Alan Rock, who now works at the United Nations. And even the reporters at the time were saying, what on earth is this? It's martial law. Well, it was actually the prototype for the Americans to copy, and we rammed it through in Canada in 1998. These guys knew what was coming because they all belonged to the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And when you look at all these laws, if they implement 1/4 of them, we're going to be under a worse tyranny than the Soviet or the Nazi era ever was.
Unbelievable. And Canadians that I know think they're smarter than Americans, but I have to make the point that we're only smarter than the Americans that they put on TV. The ones with a knowledge of the sort of Constitution and the history of America and the fact that they were the only free country in history to a large degree are in fact smarter than a lot of us, whereas we think we're nice, we think we're good people, and I think that we are capable monkeys. But anything else on Canada in terms of our relation to terror? Because this, with the Northcom drill coming up and further Northcom drills, and they're putting cops everywhere, Mr. Watt. I'm trying to say hello to them because I'm going to people are making them paranoid.
Yep.
So if I say, good morning, officer, how you doing, officer, what's going on, officer, I'm hoping to make them less paranoid by saying, look, I just said hi to you, nothing happened, so don't be paranoid.
The problem with the police, and they have had this for the last 20 years, Lenin said this too, he says, and so did Stalin, he said you must give special training to the police to make them afraid of the public. So first you separate them, just like the military. Remember, the police force is a paramilitary organization. We should never forget that. When you see them marching in uniform, one form, they belong to a separate tribe now, and that's drummed into them that they're different from you. They're no longer a member of Civilian Street. They're privately owned. They're called privates. And they've had experts going around those police forces for years now, making them paranoid of the public, telling them of what a dangerous world it is out there with all these crazy people and potential terrorists and potential mad bombers and all this kind of stuff. And the police really are on edge. You always give more indoctrination and mind alteration on the guys who are going to control the masses. So the police have more indoctrination than others. That's the sad truth of it. And the only way you can break through is one-on-one, speak as person to person, and ask them, are you willing to speak to me as a person, as opposed to a uniform, you know?
Right, and I think this is really key. I mean, it seems to me that if we can reach them, if we can reach the people with guns, then that we can convince them not to use them on us. So, any more on what the police should know about being police? I just, as a reference, a friend of mine, a friend of a friend, has recently joined the police force, and he mentioned that he was surprised by how much marching they did. They just march, march all the time, and for a cop, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, again, they're being militarized. And again, that was the agenda. Back in the early 90s, a term slipped out, which was immediately denied by the authorities, and it was called multi-jurisdictional task forces. And this was an agenda that was initially put together in the 1980s by the top war departments of all countries, where they'd amalgamate police and give them special combat training so they could be used alongside soldiers in the soldiers' arena abroad, if necessary, or back home with the soldiers backing them up. They'd fit in, they'd know the command structure, the combat techniques for urban warfare, and all the rest of it. And they've been training select groups throughout Canada for the last 10, 12 years on this very thing. Special SWAT teams and general officers from Canada are over in Iraq working with the U.S., kicking doors in, getting used to this kind of scenario. It was on television here in Canada. They called it the multi-jurisdictional task force, and they said these guys will shortly be going back to their own police units in Canada. So they're training them for what's coming along down the pike. Now, the Department of Defence in Britain, the top think tank, published its findings and its projected future for the next 30 years in The Guardian, a newspaper in England. I've got it on my website on the archive section. Look into it, because here's the top NATO think tank. That includes Canada and the US. And all they foresee for the next 30 years is massive rioting, starting from the public, and flash mobs, they call it, and the use of military and police in combined actions against the public. Nowhere does it say why the public would go to that length and start reacting that way anyway. Of course they won't, because they know the agenda is to cut back all goods and services and health services. Eventually work goes out the window too, massive unemployment as we come down in scale to join the third world in this new wonderful global plantation. And they're planning for it, and they published their findings. There's no happy news in their projected 30 years forecast at all.
Right, and Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com, the study also said that it was predictive as opposed to probable, or probable as opposed to predictive, but it basically said that they were fully expecting this in the Guardian article, which was quite shocking. And to the police and soldiers out there, I mean, they live here, they work here, they go to the bars here, their kids go to school here, and even if they're crooked, I don't think they want to be run by Northcom. I mean, you can do your little dirt on the side, but you still want to control your block. So, I mean, is there a way for the public to reach them? I mean, I'm trying to do my part with what I thought of. You know a lot more about this, but how should we approach them? Are there any angles you suggest to counteract the militarization that we're seeing?
I think you have to put across the main thing that they will understand. And that is, eventually, in society, the world is projected to come to end up in this utopia of the elite, or for the elite. The police themselves will no longer be necessary. Neither will their children. There'll be no work for their children either to go into. And so they're all expendable once their job of control, initial control to bring this agenda off, is over. They're also expendable. And we have to tell them that they're simply benefiting in the short term for their paycheck and their status and all the little freebies they get, but at the expense of their own children's lives and everyone else's lives, because the future they're going to bring in down the road is one of, it's almost a Soylent Green type scenario, with massive overcrowding in the cities, but the only place you're allowed to live for the general population, and these high-tech habitat areas for the higher bureaucracies to live in. But for ordinary police and the likes, they'll be in the main cities with the rest of the people.
Right, and it seems to me that their agenda is for North American unification by 2010 and global government by 2012, so we're not even talking about a police officer who 25 years ago could live 25 years until now, retire, and maybe have had a good life before things all went to hell. We're talking about the next 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
The police could be totally brainwashed, militarized, fitted with exploding chips, according to Officer Jack McClam at Cops and Soldiers Against the New World Order, which explode with poisoning, could kill them if they refuse orders. So if they go along with the corruption they see, asking them to do things to us, we can already see it at the airports and at the borders, where our bureaucracy is being told to treat us like jerks. Then they'll suffer from that. Can you see any other areas of Canadian society for Canadian citizens who are sort of blindly going about their business to appeal to in the bureaucracy with any specific tactics?
Again, we have to print up a lot of information for them to use, and tell them as well that if come 2010 with amalgamation, 2012 with the UN to take over the three trading blocks, then they're also going to start to be moved with their families across the whole planet. They're not to be allowed to stay in one little area for the rest of their lives, where they grow up and know their community and all the rest of it. They don't want the police to become familiar or even get friends in an area. And with a global society, they're to be moved around from country to country on a frequent basis. So they won't have a peaceful family life either. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Well, Mr. Alan Watt, and thank you so much for your time. In the final 10 minutes or so here, that'll take us to 2 hours, and then I'm definitely going to put this online as soon as possible so people can use this information. China is said to be the economic model for the New World Order. Can you speak to why, and can you speak to how we can counteract that on a macro or micro level so that we're not turned into slaves working in our country, making, zippers for jeans at a Walmart that's sold thousands of miles away?
Well, it's true. The United Nations stated that China is the model state for the world to emulate. By that, remember, we go back to communism in China, how it was given birth, who were the guys who were sent into the universities to start it up. Read Lord Bertrand Russell's books, because he was one of the first guys to be sent there to start this up on behalf of the British government, and you get it from the horse's mouth himself. So they set up a country with an ideal population that had never known individual freedom. It was an ideal country for that because of their culture, and they were an obedient culture. They'd never, as I say, they'd never known individual freedom or enterprise of any kind. It was a very fixed, rigid system they'd come out of, and so they picked China as being a sort of mass man type effort for mass production. They would obey, work long hours without complaint. And I have books in the 1930s. I say 1938, they had the Royal Institute of International Affairs world meeting in Melbourne, Australia. And they mentioned it in there that they'd set up China after World War II down the road towards the end of the millennium to be the manufacturer for the planet. They have done that, but they also have used tremendous psychology on a mass scale with the public to do with abortion. And the one child per family idea. That was tremendously interesting because they used Pavlovian techniques, and this is admitted by the elite of China. Initially they used the militia to drag off a woman who was found to be pregnant with a second child. Now, through social approval, the creation of social approval and social disapproval in the culture, the neighbors themselves will drag the woman off to the abortion clinic, and that's happening without the militia being called in. And I thought about this social approval and social disapproval technique, and I noticed they'd already used it in Canada with smoking versus anti-smoking. And indoctrinated children that if they saw a person light up across the street, they'd start coughing. That's a Pavlovian response to something, and I'd noticed this before. And I realized they were using the same techniques here of social approval and disapproval, and yet that technique could be used on anything in society. And then I looked at the United Nations that had made the war on smoking The war on drugs came from the United Nations. The war on smoking came from the United Nations. The United Nations just declared last year the war on obesity. And under the war on obesity, they want a socialized system where everyone, by a law, must be pulled into clinics to be weighed every month. I'm not kidding you. And so you realize that this is the same United Nations that backs China as the model state for the world and actually taught them these Pavlovian techniques of creating a social approval and disapproval. Well, they can make black sheep of every obese person if they want to by the same technique. We'll see people showing disgust at people who are overweight. That can be created very easily. And I think we should be very, very wary of what's really going on and learn the amounts of psychological techniques that are being promoted and marketed to the general public through special programs and through propaganda, and stop falling for it. It's no different than telling people we've got to hate the Muslims because they're different and they hate us. That's basic, simple propaganda. But it's the same thing with targeting different groups of people to attack. The majority of the mass man who can't think for himself will automatically adopt the hate that is promoted to him by their governments using specialized marketing into their minds.
Right, absolutely. Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. I've already heard doctors, secondhand story of a doctor saying about vaccines and whatnot, that they have to make sure we are not a drain on the system's resources in the future by using vaccines as a preventive measure now. So it's not that hard to get people to look at other people as the enemy in this system.
Yes, and they tried that too with the CBC and government ads using our tax money when it came to be the flu season. And the ad said, do you know if you don't take your vaccine, you could be a danger to others? And I thought, boy, they could really push this if they wanted to. It's going along the same direction by using threats, you see, and the threat's directed to those who won't take the vaccine, and the threat will come from those who have taken the vaccine, and you haven't. So they use mob psychology against the people.
Unbelievable. Well, Mr. Watt, a word to the wise, to the secret government. I mean, these people are going through with plans that are going to catch up with them a lot sooner than they think. I think they enjoy being sort of gods in this world and having the power over us, $2,000 hookers, special bank accounts, and that sort of thing. But that's all going to hell. That's all going to rot shortly if the people above them have their way and their say. So for the people that are soldiers of sort of dead inbred trash carrying out ancient plans that they really should have updated and changed by now, what would you have to say to them and appeal with your sort of experience in understanding sort of the big picture?
Well, to the soldiers, I get enough of them phoning me from the States who come back as nervous wrecks. Some of the guys went to Fallujah and were told that there's a killing field, kill everything that moves, where it's a dog, cat, or a human, or a child. And they did, and they were told to go to village and show examples by slaughtering everybody, which they did. And now some of these young guys are coming home, their conditioning is breaking down, and the real person is breaking through, and now their psychological nature is breaking down. They're in quite the mess because they've been trained to do things which are anti-human and would be outright murder, mass murder, premeditated murder in civilian life. So regardless of what you think at the time, once they take your little anti-malarial drugs off you, which are hallucinogenic, by the way, they've even did documentation here in the CBC and about them. We know that Somalian soldiers, the guys in Somalia, were hallucinating on these drugs. One of the officers pulled a pistol on the child's head every day just for the fun of it and can't believe himself that he did it now. So once these drugs wear off and you're back in Civvy Street again, your health's going to break down, both your physical and your psychological health, because you have to start trying to live with you.
Right, we learned this. I mean, there's been tons of movies about Vietnam with respect to flashbacks and the horrors that haunt people. I mean, 25% of America's homeless are Vietnam veterans. So for all the sort of military sales pitch that sells us the nobility of the military and the honor of the military, they treat their own like crap on almost every level.
Yep. And this is happening again. And I've also had troops come back who are starting to bleed. They're coughing up blood and stuff. They don't know what they've inhaled, if it's due to the inoculations. So there are quite a few of them are in a bad way already. But that makes perfect sense, because after the Vietnam era, the Pentagon had big meetings about the misgivings of having professionally trained soldiery amongst its population in times of change back home. They could be a threat. So the best way to do it is to get 2 or 3 good years out of them in the military. Make sure you inject something into them that will bring down their health once they leave the military, and then they're no threat to anyone back home.
So this is all by design. I mean, I have a theory that they want to destroy our domestic cops and soldiers to some degree, so they could bring in UN peacekeepers and troops as an option in the future. Do you see that as a possibility for people who will shoot us because they don't live here?
Yeah, in fact, it was David Rockefeller made a speech in California back in the late 70s, early 80s about that very topic. It was about the United Nations coming in to the United States, different forces from other countries. And he said at the time that under the right circumstances, the Americans would welcome them in, especially if they're bringing in food and medical aid and so on. But look at the British Empire. It always employed other countries which it had taken over. It would employ certain young guys to become soldiery for Britain. Well, we did that in India with the sepoy regiments, and turned them on other people with India from the south. So you always use people from a different area that has nothing, no affiliation with the present culture they're put into, to suppress the people down below them. We saw it with the Tiananmen Square massacre. They brought in the troops, the Mongolian troops from the north, and they brought them down. They had no affiliation with the average Chinese. So you always use foreign troops to beat people up, and they have no physical, cultural bonding with you.
Right, and yet we saw in New Orleans how American troops would disarm and shoot fellow Americans, especially if they were black in the fairly racist U.S. So, you know, the socialization of our soldiers and cops and military and bureaucracy against us is pretty deep. Do you see any levels, any schisms, kind of as a final word to this, or any other final thoughts you have? I'm just trying to look for the people that we can reach and the people that we can't, and separate them and try and force a schism between them. I understand Maurice Strong and certain others at the very top of the food chain are probably going to be guaranteed jobs at the UN, probably going to be guaranteed to be one of the 500 million left on Earth after the 6 billion are killed. But there's a ton of others who, as big as their egos get for being part of this big, successful, evil system, are going to be culled. So where do you see the schisms that we should work on?
I think we've got to go into looking at the bureaucracies behind it. There's so many layers of bureaucrats dealing with the system. In fact, Lenin said this because he knew the agenda. Lenin himself said that dictatorship will last about 70 years, then we'll meld into the West. Gorbachev, in his final speech at the Politburo, and as well reported by Eric Margolis in the Toronto Sun, people should look it up and get that speech that was made by Gorbachev. He said, you'll hear shortly that communism is dead, but now we're moving into the amalgamation with the West. We're moving out to make a socialized world. Well, Lenin mentioned it much earlier and said, too, a time will come towards the end of the millennium into the next millennium where there'll be so many governmental agencies, they'll be treading on each other's toes. They'll be stepping over into others' jurisdictions, and they'll start having a lot of confusion amongst themselves and fights and territorial fights. We've got to get through to those guys that their jobs, once that happens, which it already is, that means their jobs are going to be limited. They themselves won't be necessary for very much longer. The United Nations is ready to come in with a completely different bureaucratic system, and the local bureaucracies will go under. They're going to be obsolete very shortly. We've got to tell them this so they know.
Unbelievable. On the game of musical chairs, they're taking most of the chairs away. It's ridiculous. So these guys are not guaranteed a spot just because they serve the system, and I guess it's important to know that. Mr. Alan Watt from CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com, I'd just like to thank you so much for all of your work and your continued efforts and your time today. And I hope we can do this again, and I hope